The pilots fought desperately to overcome a deadly mistake on a routine flight, but they lost, and they ended up 54 degrees nose high and stalled and crashed just 35 seconds after takeoff, killing all 21 people on board. And the shocking details of the investigation would forever change the airline industry and how everyone travels. My name is Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. On the morning of January 8, 2003, Air Midwest Flight 5481 was scheduled for a routine flight from Charlotte, North Carolina to Greensboro, South Carolina. The plane was completely packed with 19 passengers, and they departed the gate at 8:30 a.m. Everything seemed normal as the plane had already completed one flight that morning and 6 flights the previous day without any issues. The aircraft they're flying is a Beechcraft 1900D, which is known for its sturdy build and reliable performance. It can carry up to 19 passengers and was known for its stand-up cabin that allowed most passengers to walk upright, which was an unusual feature for a small aircraft. It was considered very safe to fly, and in fact the investigation revealed that the reasons why the plane crashed had nothing to do with the inherent design or the manufacturing of the aircraft. However, there were some major issues that the investigators were looking at. The 2 pilots flying the plane are Captain Catherine Leslie, known as Katie, and First Officer Jonathan Gibbs. Katie was just 25 years old and was the youngest captain flying for the airline, but she had over 1,800 hours of flight time with the company, including over 1,100 hours as a captain on the Beechcraft 1900. The Czech airman that flew with her said she was one of the better pilots. She was also very well respected by the first officers that she flew with. Jonathan was 27 years old, and he had just over 700 hours of experience on the aircraft, and other pilots described him as talented and a very precise pilot with good attention to detail. They were both based in Charlotte, and this was not the first time that these two had flown together. In fact, when the investigators discovered the terrible mistake that caused the crash, they were actually quite shocked to learn that Katie and Jonathan had flown the accident aircraft on 6 flights the day before the crash. The mistake hadn't caused the crash yet, and Katie and Jonathan got plenty of rest that night, and they showed up for work on January 8th, not knowing that this would be the last time they would ever go flying. As the passengers were boarding the aircraft, Katie and Jonathan were busy going over the flight paperwork, verifying their weight and balance calculations. This is extremely important because they need to make sure they don't exceed their maximum allowable takeoff weight, and they need to know how many bags there are and how they're situated in the cargo area so they can determine whether the aircraft's center of gravity is within limits for the flight. According to the cockpit voice recorder, they accounted for all 19 passengers, and they knew that there were a lot of bags on the plane because the ramp agent told them they had counted 31 bags, including the carry-ons, and they had 1 tire in the cargo area. The 2 pilots took several minutes to review the numbers because the company dispatch had authorized up to 32 bags on the flight, and the ramp agent also told them that some of the bags were pretty heavy. In fact, the agent estimated that 2 of the pieces of luggage were between 70 and 80 pounds, but this is just going to be one of the problems that's a contributing factor to the crash, and it's not the biggest mistake. Before we see what happens next, since we're talking about luggage, I want to take a minute to tell you about today's sponsor, Sterling Pacific. You guys know I travel a lot for work, so I've seen and I've tried a lot of suitcases, but I honestly think this one really stands out from all the rest. And in full disclosure, I don't use this for work travel because it's silver and the airline that I fly with requires us to use black colored luggage, which is why I enjoy using this when I'm on personal travel, especially because it doesn't make me feel like an airline pilot commuting for work. This thing is made out of high-grade 5052 aluminum, which is the same type of aluminum that's used in commercial aircraft, and this thing is just as sturdy as it looks. There aren't any cheap plastic parts on it. You've got Italian grain leather handles. Everything is reinforced. Even the wheels have these aluminum hubcaps, which I actually prefer compared to the bags with the 4-wheel design because those are always breaking off. It also has, instead of a zipper, it's got these dual latch TSA combination locks here. And a hinge type lid stays open whenever you're packing. So it really just maximizes the space, and you can tell there's just a lot of attention to detail that went into this thing that I think frequent flyers and pilots are definitely going to appreciate. And I'll admit this might not be the most affordable option, but if you really like high-end products and you're not willing to compromise, then Sterling Pacific is giving my audience $300 off when you use the discount code found in the video description. So be sure to check them out because you can get a great deal while also supporting the channel. And now let's get back to the terrible tragedy that's unfolding. The maximum allowable takeoff weight for the Beechcraft 1900 was 17,120 pounds. When Katie and Jonathan double-checked their numbers and adjusted for the fact that one of the passengers was a child, they came up with 17,018 pounds. If they had accounted for the actual weights of the heavy bags, then their revised weight was 17,078 pounds, which was still under the max allowable takeoff weight. They also calculated the center of gravity to be 37.8% of the mean aerodynamic chord, which is under the aft limit of 40%. So as far as they were concerned, they were close, but they were still within the limits. The best way I can explain why these numbers are so important is the saying that a nose-heavy plane flies poorly and a tail-heavy plane flies poorly once. If your center of gravity is too far aft, the aircraft nose is going to pitch up on takeoff, and you might not have enough control authority to counteract that and save the plane. And this is where the investigation took a very interesting turn, because even if the pilots had miscalculated the center of gravity or their takeoff weight, then the aircraft still shouldn't have been that far out of limits, and Katie and Jonathan should have still been able to control the plane. That's why the investigators started taking a close look at the aircraft maintenance history, and that's when they made several disturbing discoveries. Probably the most alarming was what they discovered regarding the FAA oversight of the airline. During the 2 years before the accident, the FAA Principal Maintenance Inspector identified multiple issues with Air Midwest maintenance training program. These deficiencies included inadequate oversight of training, inadequate record keeping, and lack of adherence to company training procedures. As a result, the FAA wrote letters to the airline urging them to make improvements, but 5 months later, deficiencies still existed and training was not being conducted in accordance with company procedures. 1 year later, in the spring of 2002, the FAA was going to delay the airline's expansion because of these unresolved concerns, and probably the most frustrating part of the investigation is this paragraph right here. As of August 2002, the Air Midwest PMI had still planned to delay the expansion. However, an FAA operations supervisor advised them against the delay. Even though deficiencies were clearly documented by the FAA did not use the airline's expansion request as leverage to effect improvements in the maintenance training program. Essentially, for 2 years, the FAA knew that something was wrong, and they never held the airline accountable. When investigators looked into the most recent maintenance work performed, they discovered it was done by mechanics who were subcontractors from another company, and they weren't fully familiar with the Beechcraft 1900. These guys were supposed to be doing routine maintenance on the aircraft, including checking the elevator tension cables, but neither of the two mechanics assigned to the task had done this before, but the inspector had, and he planned to provide them with on-the-job training. However, he told them that they could skip some steps in their work because he didn't think that the manufacturer intended for mechanics to follow the entire procedure, and what's worse is that instead of providing them oversight and training, he just told them what to do and then he left to go do other stuff, assuming they would do it correctly. If they had actually done the full procedure, they might have discovered their mistake and realized that the elevators wouldn't move beyond 7 degrees nose down, well short of the manufacturer's standard of 14 to 15 degrees. And the reason there weren't any problems on the previous flights was because there's never really a good reason to pitch more than 7 degrees nose down. So as far as the pilots were concerned, the aircraft was fully functional. But now comes the shocking part of the story, because what they discovered next would forever change the airline industry and how people travel. At the time of the crash, airlines were allowed to use actual weights for baggage and passengers, or they could use average weights. Now, following the guidance from Air Midwest, Katie and Jonathan calculated their performance numbers using an average weight of 175 pounds for adults and 80 pounds for kids. Now, those weights included 10 pounds per passenger for carry-on luggage. Remember though, this is a Beechcraft 1900, so there's no overhead bin. So your carry-on is just whatever you can fit under the seat in front of you. And if it doesn't fit, then they're going to assume it's only 25 pounds, and they also use an average weight of 25 pounds for every piece of checked luggage. These were the same average weights that all airlines around the country were using at the time, and they hadn't been updated since 1936. After the crash, a survey of several air carriers revealed the average weight of an adult was 195.63 pounds. That's 20 pounds more than the weights that Katie and Jonathan were using on the day of the crash. Based on actual weights, the safety board determined that the aircraft was 17,700 pounds, almost 600 pounds overweight, and this also meant that the center of gravity was actually 45.5%, which was well aft of the 40% limit. The further aft the center of gravity, the stronger the pitch-up movement would be on takeoff, and the more nose-down authority the pilots would need to counteract that force. And normally that aft center of gravity by itself would have been controllable with about 9 to 10 degrees of nose-down authority, but because of the terrible mistake of the elevator rigging limiting them to 7 degrees, it was impossible to control the aircraft, and Katie and Jonathan never knew that this routine flight would end in a disaster. And if you learned something from this pilot debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.